The story of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary begins in a setting where human glory lived side by side with political instability, territorial tensions, and the spiritual dramas of the 13th century. Born in the year 1207, the daughter of King Andrew II of Hungary and Queen Gertrude of Mercia, Elizabeth came into the world surrounded by the pomp, riches, and symbolism of royalty, but also by an environment of internal disputes and external pressures that profoundly shaped the destiny of the European kingdoms. From the earliest accounts, it is possible to perceive that her coming into the world was surrounded by a sense of divine predestination. Even though she was surrounded by silk, gold, and imposing castles, that little girl carried within herself a simplicity of soul and a sensitivity to human suffering that were completely outside the norm of her time. Her royal childhood never drew her away from the call of God. On the contrary, it was precisely in this environment of contrasts that her vocation began to blossom with surprising strength. The Hungarian court in which Elizabeth grew up was marked by elaborate ceremonies, rigid hierarchies, and social expectations that weighed on every member of the royal family. The education of a princess included dance, etiquette, foreign languages, basic knowledge of politics and diplomacy, as well as religious practices intended to shape morally the women of noble lineage. However, Elizabeth surprised her tutors and even her relatives, for while other girls were dazzled by jewels, expensive garments, and courtly protocols, she was enchanted by the stories of the saints, by the lives of the poor, and even by small opportunities to sacrifice herself for the good of her neighbor. Her eyes frequently filled with tears when she heard accounts of hungry women and children, and it was common to find her in prayer before small images of Christ, asking him to teach her to live in humility and purity, even within royalty. The accounts of her childhood often highlight her gentle, generous, and deeply spiritual temperament. Though she was still very young, Elizabeth already understood that human life, however glorious it might appear in the eyes of the world, only acquired true meaning when it was lived in harmony with the divine will. There was in her an almost supernatural sensitivity to perceive the suffering of others, and her heart, marked by a rare compassion, seemed always restless in the face of the inequalities she witnessed, even within her own castle. Many servants testified that the princess could not bear to see anyone sad or in need without trying to offer some sort of consolation, even if it were only a kind word, some food secretly given, or a silent gesture of solidarity. Her soul, from an early age, seemed shaped not by earthly royalty, but by the kingship of Christ. The death of her mother, Queen Gertrude, marked the young Elizabeth deeply and further accentuated her inclination toward a life of prayer and mercy. The brutal assassination of Gertrude, a victim of internal conflicts within the Hungarian nobility, exposed Elizabeth, still a child, to the harshness of the world and the fragility of earthly powers. Many expected such a tragedy to give rise in her to resentment, hardness of heart, or political ambition, but exactly the opposite occurred. Elizabeth turned even more toward God, finding in him the only consolation capable of filling the void left by the loss of her mother. This spiritual wound, far from drawing her away from holiness, refined her character and strengthened her resolve to dedicate her life to divine love and charity. It was in this turbulent context that Elizabeth was betrothed in marriage to the young Louis, son of Count Hermann I of Thuringia, as part of a political alliance between kingdoms. As was customary at the time, she was sent while still a child to Wartburg Castle in the region of Thuringia, where she was to grow up alongside her future husband, learning the customs of the German court and preparing herself to assume a prominent role in local government. Many feared that the young princess would suffer from such an abrupt change of environment, since the court at Wartburg differed from the Hungarian court in culture, language, and customs. However, Elizabeth demonstrated an impressive maturity and a docility that charmed the members of the German court. Still a girl, she began to captivate everyone with her purity and her ability to find God in every detail of life. Life in Wartburg Castle was a period of transformation for Elizabeth, who matured spiritually in an extraordinary way. There, far from her family and homeland, she found in prayer a safe harbor and in fraternal love her daily mission. Even surrounded by rigid protocols and social expectations, she continued to seek opportunities to serve, to observe the poor who came to the castle gates, and to offer them not only food or coins, but words overflowing with Christian compassion. It was common to see her among the beggars, sitting on the ground, talking with them as if they were old friends, listening to their sorrows and assuring them that God was always with them, even in the darkest moments. This attitude unsettled part of the nobility, who viewed with strangeness her preference for the simplicity of the poor rather than the courtesies of the palace. As she grew, Elizabeth also developed a unique relationship with the liturgy and the sacraments of the Church. For her, participating in Holy Mass was not merely a court obligation, but a moment of intimate encounter with Christ, in which her soul found strength to continue practicing the charity that moved her so much. Witnesses say that she often wept during the consecration, deeply touched by the real presence of Jesus in the Eucharist. These manifestations of sincere faith stirred admiration and at the same time discomfort among some members of the court, who could not understand how a princess could possess such spiritual intensity. However, for Elizabeth, nothing was more important than the love of God and his transforming presence. In the midst of this interior growth, she also developed a deep devotion to the Virgin Mary, to whom she entrusted her anxieties and hopes. She liked to pray the office of the Blessed Virgin and carried with her small Marian images to which she turned whenever her heart was gripped by homesickness for Hungary or by the tension of court life. The motherhood of Mary, in particular, was for her a constant source of consolation, since she felt the absence of her own mother. She found in the Mother of God the tenderness that so strengthened her spiritually and taught her to trust fully in providence. With time, it became clear to everyone in Wartburg that Elizabeth was not an ordinary princess. Her kindness attracted, her humility disarmed, and her joy overflowed in such a way that everyone, from servants to nobles, felt comforted simply by her presence. Despite the demands of the nobility, Elizabeth always preferred simple places, suffering faces, calloused hands, and humble voices asking for help. It was evident that the love of Christ shaped her every gesture, and many commented that they had never seen such purity in someone so young. It was in this environment that her future union with Louis began to take on contours not only political, but deeply spiritual and affective. From early on, Louis showed great admiration for the young princess, becoming enchanted by her faith, her charity, and her sweetness. The affection between the two grew silently, as a gift from God preparing the hearts of both for a greater mission. To live marriage as a path to holiness, bearing witness to the beauty of Christian love in a world where political interests often suffocated the spiritual truth of marriage. Thus, while still very young, Elizabeth was already giving clear signs that her life would be entirely dedicated to the service of God and the poor. Her childhood and youth, marked by deep losses, geographical displacements, political tensions, and royal responsibilities, did not divert her from the purity of her calling. On the contrary, they made her vocation even firmer, more radiant, and more fruitful. God was preparing in that girl one of the greatest saints in the history of the Church, whose life would be a beacon of charity, humility, and fidelity to the gospel. The marriage between Elizabeth and Louis of Thuringia is remembered as one of the most beautiful testimonies of Christian love ever lived within medieval nobility. At a time when most royal marriages were marked by cold political alliances, economic interests, and territorial agreements, Elizabeth and Louis defied the logic of power by transforming their marriage into a true school of holiness. Louis, although heir to an important German territory, never treated Elizabeth as a piece in a political arrangement. On the contrary, he saw in his wife a gift from God, a woman whose pure and charitable soul illuminated the castle and served as an inspiration to everyone around. Their mutual love grew in simplicity, truth, and faith, leading them to a deeply harmonious and spiritually elevated union. From the beginning of their married life, Elizabeth showed that her position as Countess of Thuringia would not separate her from the spirit of poverty and humility taught by Christ. Although she wore royal garments and fulfilled courtly obligations, she never allowed these adornments to penetrate her heart. She often exchanged luxurious fabrics for simpler clothing when visiting the poor, and sometimes even refrained from eating elaborate meals so they could be distributed to those in need. Far from reproaching her, Louis admired her generosity deeply and saw in his wife a constant example of the presence of God. Many accounts say that he would even say he preferred to renounce the throne rather than interfere in any charitable work carried out by Elizabeth, for he knew that her holiness was sustained by the divine will. The harmony between them was so intense that Wartburg Castle became a refuge of peace, where conjugal love was lived not as a passing passion, but as a supernatural vocation. Elizabeth dedicated herself to her husband with affection and devotion, accompanying him in political decisions, praying for him during his absences, and welcoming him with tenderness in times of fatigue. Louis, in turn, treated Elizabeth with profound respect, always attentive to his wife's spiritual needs, encouraging her to persevere in faith and charity. This mutual relationship was a luminous testimony to the nobility of the time, who often did not understand how two young people of such elevated position could choose to live with such simplicity, humility, and dedication to the gospel. Elizabeth's devotion to the poor intensified even more after her marriage. With authority and freedom within the castle, she organized small teams to care for the sick, distribute food, remedy injustices, and attend to the most urgent needs of the people. She was often seen carrying baskets of bread, wine, flour, medicinal herbs, or clothing in her hands, walking through the streets of Eisenach or the nearby villages. Her welcoming smile and gentle presence won the respect even of the hardest hearts. Some criticized her for exaggerating in her charity, claiming that her zeal could harm the castle's reserves, but Louis always defended her, saying that nothing could be more useful for the kingdom than charity practiced so generously. One of the most famous episodes in the life of Saint Elizabeth occurred precisely during this period and became known over the centuries as the Miracle of the Roses. One day, while she was carrying bread hidden under her cloak to distribute to the poor, she was surprised by Louis, or according to another version, by members of the court who sought to reprimand her. When asked what she was carrying, she opened her cloak, and the bread had miraculously been transformed into beautiful roses in the middle of winter. This extraordinary sign not only bore witness to the purity of her intentions, but also revealed that God approved of and accompanied her works of charity. The episode became a symbol of her life. Everything that Elizabeth touched with love was transformed into beauty in the eyes of God. Despite such a virtuous life, Elizabeth also faced moments of trial within the court. Not everyone viewed her boundless generosity favorably, and some nobles murmured that she was wasting the castle's resources on insignificant people. There were those who feared her actions might offend political alliances or damage local administration. However, Elizabeth bore within herself an inner strength that was not shaken by criticism. She always responded with meekness and serenity, recalling that Christ made himself poor to save humanity and that serving the poor was serving God himself. She knew that true love disturbs hardened hearts, but this never stopped her in her mission. Elizabeth's spirituality was sustained by a deep sacramental life. She participated in Holy Mass with admirable frequency, often kneeling in the snow to pray in silence when she could not go to the castle chapel. She spent long moments in prayer before the crucifix, contemplating the sufferings of Christ and asking for the grace to imitate him in humility and love for the marginalized. She had as her confessor a Franciscan, Friar Rudolph, who guided her spiritually according to the ideal of Saint Francis of Assisi. This contact with the Franciscan charism would shape her heart even more, leading her toward a life of voluntary poverty and trusting abandonment to Providence. Between Elizabeth and Louis, there also existed an admirable spiritual union. They encouraged each other to seek holiness, prayed together, shared the challenges of governing, and always sought God's will in their decisions. Louis understood his wife's vocation so deeply that he openly declared she was the greatest treasure God had given him. For him, Elizabeth was not only a wife, but a living reflection of God's presence in his life. The tenderness and respect with which they treated one another were so intense that many claimed never to have seen such a harmonious marriage among members of the nobility. The people, for their part, loved Elizabeth with an affection that was almost filial. When she walked through the villages and streets of Thuringia, the poor followed her as one follows a mother. She knew by name many of those she helped and often brought abandoned children, sick women, starving elderly, and even lepers to the castle. She created small, improvised hospitals within the fortress itself and turned some rooms into infirmaries. For her, there was no difference between king and beggar when it came to serving Christ. All deserved dignity, affection, and care. As their marriage matured, Elizabeth revealed more and more the greatness of her soul. Despite the privileged position she held, she never allowed pride or vanity to dominate her heart. She remained the same humble young woman who had grown up among castles and sufferings and who saw in the gospel her only wealth. Her kindness, her self-giving to the poor, and her love for God was so intense that the entire castle was transformed into a reflection of her spiritual light. And at her side, Louis also grew in virtue, learning that to govern is not to impose power, but to serve with justice and compassion. The charity of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary reached its full splendor during the years in which she lived as Countess of Thuringia. Her ability to see Christ in every person in need went beyond any common practice of almsgiving. She lived charity as a total and continuous self-giving, almost without limits. It was not a matter of merely distributing food or clothing, but of plunging deeply into the suffering of the poor, touching their wounds, welcoming their sorrows, and consoling their tears with a maternal tenderness that impressed even the most insensitive. For Elizabeth, charity was not a moral duty, but the concrete way of living the gospel. She herself said that the poor were her lords, because in them Christ manifested himself with greater clarity and urgency. With Louis's support, who recognized and admired her mission, Elizabeth began to build shelters and infirmaries inside and outside the castle. Many times, she opened the fortress doors to receive beggars, widows, orphans, and the sick who had nowhere else to go. One of her most moving gestures was to personally bring the most debilitated patients to her own rooms, where she washed their wounds, offered food she had prepared herself, and spent entire nights awake to relieve the suffering of those who were on the verge of death. She had special affection for lepers, who were rejected by medieval society and often expelled from the cities. Elizabeth not only visited them, but embraced them, kissed their wounds, and cared for them with a love that scandalized the nobility. The intensity of her compassion caused misunderstandings within the court. Many nobles believed Elizabeth exaggerated in her dedication to the poor, claiming that her sensitivity could compromise the government or even offend political alliances with other regions. Some said she put her own health at risk by approaching patients considered dangerous. Nonetheless, Elizabeth never allowed herself to be shaken by such criticism. When questioned about her closeness to lepers, she would often say that in their wounds she contemplated the wounds of Christ crucified. What might be considered repugnant in the eyes of the world was for her a motive for love and veneration, because there resided the living presence of the Lord. This deep understanding of the spiritual value of human suffering led Elizabeth to create permanent structures of assistance to the poor, anticipating institutions that, centuries later, would become fundamental in Christian life, such as hospitals, hostels, and centers of welcome. She herself administered these works, checking needs, guiding the servants, and even taking part in the preparation of food. It was common to see her kneeling in the kitchen, cutting vegetables or kneading bread, while talking to the servants and offering them spiritual counsel. Living with the Countess was so edifying that many servants experienced profound conversions simply through the silent witness of her holiness. One of the most impressive gestures of her life of charity occurred when a devastating famine hit the region of Thuringia. Faced with the misery that spread rapidly, Elizabeth opened the castle granaries without hesitation, distributing all the wheat, all the flour, and all the food reserves to the poor. Many nobles accused her of irresponsibility, claiming she was putting the court's security at risk. However, she answered serenely, repeating that divine providence would never abandon those who trusted in the love of Christ. And indeed, even with such generous distribution, food never ran out in the castle throughout the crisis. Elizabeth's faith sustained the works she carried out, as if God himself were silently multiplying the resources. Besides material charity, Elizabeth also devoted herself to the spiritual formation of the people, offering counsel, prayers, and words of hope. On many days, she would go out to meet the poor with small wooden crosses she had made herself, encouraging them to trust in divine mercy. Her presence was so consoling that many said that merely seeing her was enough to bring relief to the soul. For the discouraged, she was comfort; for the sick, healing; for the desperate, light. Elizabeth's charity was not just a social work, but a true sacrament of love, a visible sign of the invisible grace that Christ poured out through her. Elizabeth's spiritual influence grew so much that many times the poor came to the castle not only to ask for material help, but also to be heard. She had the gift of receiving confidences deeply, offering spiritual guidance with simplicity and wisdom. Her capacity for listening was one of her greatest gifts. In her presence, no one felt judged, diminished, or discarded. All were treated as children of God, and from this experience sprang consolations that marked deeply the hearts of those who sought her out. A notable aspect of Elizabeth's spirituality was her life of penance. Even living in the castle, she practiced rigorous fasts, offered silent sacrifices, and slept on a wooden board covered only by a rough cloth as a way of uniting herself to the sufferings of the poorest. On some occasions, she discreetly took off royal jewels and ornaments to replace them with hair shirts or penitential cords hidden under her clothing, living what St. Francis of Assisi called interior poverty. This mortification was not motivated by contempt for the body, but by love for Christ, whom she wished to imitate in every detail of her life. The more she gave herself to sacrifices, the more intensely she felt the presence of God illuminating her soul. Her practice of prayer was also admirable. She spent long periods in silence before the tabernacle, seeking strength to continue her works. She knelt in the snow at dawn to pray for the poor who died of cold. She carried small fragments of the gospel with her and frequently repeated verses that marked her soul, especially those related to mercy. The entire castle knew that Elizabeth prayed unceasingly, and many commented that her face changed after prayer, taking on a serene glow that could only be explained by her profound union with God. By living this radical charity, Elizabeth completely transformed the environment of Thuringia, making Wartburg Castle a true beacon of mercy in the midst of a world marked by wars, disease, and inequality. Her life bore witness that holiness was not the privilege of monks or hermits, but could flourish in the heart of a married woman, a mother, and someone embroiled in the challenges of medieval politics. In every gesture, every word, and every sacrifice, Elizabeth let Christ's love shine forth, and thus she prepared herself for the dramatic events that were to come, events that would reveal, even more deeply, the greatness of her soul. The life of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary took a dramatic and deeply painful turn when one of the greatest trials of her existence fell upon her, the sudden death of her beloved husband, Louis of Thuringia. Until then, Elizabeth's life, although marked by sacrifices and constant self-giving, found in conjugal love a safe refuge and a source of spiritual balance. Louis understood her vocation, supported her charitable works, and walked with her in the pursuit of holiness. Their union was so solid that many said they seemed like soulmates destined by God for the same mission. Therefore, when Louis departed for the crusade and fell victim to an epidemic along the way, Elizabeth experienced a sorrow so profound that only divine grace could sustain her. The news of Louis's death reached the castle as a devastating blow. When Elizabeth received confirmation of the tragedy, she burst into tears, and her lament, according to the accounts, seemed to come not only from her throat, but from the depths of her wounded soul. She loved her husband with a rare purity and intensity, and did not hide her pain. Yet even in the midst of tears, she uttered a phrase that revealed the greatness of her spirit. "He is dead. The world is dead to me, and now all that remains for me is God." These words show that, though deeply wounded, Elizabeth found consolation in the only love that never abandons those who trust in him. Louis's death, however, unleashed not only emotional suffering, but also a series of political injustices that left Elizabeth and her children in a situation of extreme abandonment. Without her husband's support, some members of the court, driven by ambition and resentment of the intense charity she practiced, saw an opportunity to expel her from the castle. In one of the most cruel scenes of her life, Elizabeth was cast out of Wartburg in the middle of the night, under heavy rain and cold, taking with her only her children and a few clothes. She, who had devoted herself to the poor for so many years, now experienced in her own flesh the pain of abandonment, insecurity, and humiliation. The suffering of that night is remembered as one of the most moving moments in the history of Christian holiness. While she walked, her children trembling with cold at her side, Elizabeth raised her heart to God and repeated that he would never abandon those who, for love of Christ, chose poverty and humility. In some villages, she was charitably welcomed by people who recognized her goodness. In others, however, she faced contempt and closed doors. The countess who had once fed thousands was now treated as a beggar, yet she did not murmur or rebel. On the contrary, she accepted everything with serenity and trust, seeing in these trials a real participation in the sufferings of Christ. At this point in the story, Elizabeth could have sought support in political, family, or even military alliances, but she chose to remain faithful to the Franciscan spirit that she had already embraced interiorly with such conviction. Louis's death, instead of hardening her heart, strengthened her total surrender to the divine will. She began to live in radical poverty, renouncing all claim to power, status, or influence. Though the heir of two royal lineages, she decided to live as a servant of the poor, relying solely on providence. Her life then became even more similar to that of Christ, who had nowhere to lay his head, but whose divine serenity sustained every step of his mission. After months of trials and uncertainty, Elizabeth finally found support in her uncle, the bishop of the region, who provided shelter and protection for her and her children. Her material situation remained difficult, but she showed an inner peace that amazed all who met her. Many asked how a woman who had lost her husband, social position, and security could maintain such serenity. Elizabeth replied that in the heart of Christ she found sufficient strength to keep going. Her love for God had not diminished with adversity. On the contrary, it had grown and become even purer. As time passed, the political tensions were resolved and her children had their rights restored. However, Elizabeth no longer sought to return to the comfort of her former life. She had understood that her mission in the world was to serve the poor with even greater radicality, to give her life totally to God, and to live the Franciscan ideal in its fullness. The experience of loss and humiliation had so purified her soul that her faith became luminous, deep, and detached from any ties to earthly power. Louis's death, though devastating, became an occasion of extraordinary grace for her march toward holiness. Sorrow also drew Elizabeth even closer to the sufferings of Christ crucified. She meditated frequently on the Passion, reading passages from the Gospel and contemplating with tears the infinite love of Jesus for each person. She saw in Christ's sacrifice the model for her own life and understood that just as he had been rejected, despised, and unjustly condemned, she too should accept with patience and love the sufferings that the world imposed on her. This mystical union with Jesus' sufferings nourished her hope and granted her a supernatural strength that enchanted and edified everyone around her. From that moment on, Elizabeth began to organize her life with total simplicity. She renounced silk dresses, chose humble garments, and devoted herself even more to silent prayer. She spent entire nights in contemplation, asking God for the grace to transform each pain into love, each loss into trusting abandonment, and each humiliation into pure offering. Her heart, although marked by longing for her husband, was now completely surrendered to the divine will. She loved Louis deeply, but she understood that human life is fleeting, whereas union with God is eternal. Thus, the tragedy that could have destroyed her became the path by which God led her to an even higher holiness. Elizabeth was now a woman free from everything that bound her to the world, free from vanity, free from power, free from riches, free from titles, and even free from emotional attachment that might prevent her total surrender to Christ. And in this spiritual freedom, her true vocation would finally blossom in a complete and definitive way in the years that remained. After the intense trials she endured following Louis's death, Saint Elizabeth of Hungary emerged as an even more purified soul, ready to embrace fully the Franciscan spirit that had already burned in her heart since her earliest youth. The presence of the Friars Minor in the region had deeply marked her understanding of the gospel, especially concerning voluntary poverty, total detachment from the world, and radical imitation of Christ. Elizabeth, who had always found joy in serving and consoling the poor, discovered in the teachings of Saint Francis of Assisi the perfect path for her soul. From that moment on, she decided to live not only as a friend of the poor, but as a true sister to them, completely stripped of herself and surrendered to divine providence. With her gentle, humble, and deeply spiritual temperament, Elizabeth began to discern more clearly God's will for her life. She knew that her mission had not ended with the suffering she had faced, but that Christ himself was now asking her for an even more total, more concrete, and more sacrificial charity. For this reason, She sought out Conrad of Marburg, a strict and zealous priest who would become her spiritual director. Though known for his extreme severity, Conrad saw in Elizabeth a soul so pure, so docile, and so inclined to holiness that he did not hesitate to guide her toward complete surrender to the evangelical life. Under his direction, Elizabeth made a vow to renounce definitively the privileges of nobility, embracing a voluntary poverty that would scandalize many, but open the doors to an even deeper love for Christ. From this commitment on, Elizabeth began to live in radical simplicity. She left behind luxurious dresses, jewelry, and princess adornments, choosing to wear simple clothing, similar to that of the poor women she used to assist. She no longer wished to be recognized by the glory of royal blood, but by the silent glory of the cross of Christ. For many, it was incomprehensible that such a young, beautiful, influential, and rich woman, heir to 2 kingdoms, would so decisively renounce all earthly comforts and securities. But Elizabeth was not guided by human criteria. Her heart burned only with the desire to love as Jesus loved, to serve as he served, and to console as he consoled. This decision, though radical, was for her the source of such deep spiritual joy that nothing in the world could take it from her. One of the most grand and moving works of her life arose precisely from this evangelical radicality, the founding of a large hospital in Marburg. Elizabeth decided to invest practically all the resources she still possessed, and even goods restored to her by ecclesiastical authority, to create a place where the poor, the sick, and the abandoned could find not only material care, but love, dignity, and spiritual consolation. The hospital became her great work of mercy, a visible reflection of the kingdom of God in the midst of medieval society. It was not a simple or improvised building. She had proper rooms built, care areas, lodging, infirmaries, and spaces for the gravely ill, all intended to offer the needy a treatment that was both dignified and Christian. Elizabeth not only financed or administered the hospital, she lived in it as servant and mother of the poor. It was common to see her carrying water, preparing soups, changing bandages, washing wounds, comforting the dying, and spending entire nights watching over the agonizing. Her presence was so constant that many said the hospital was not merely her work, but her own spiritual home, where she became mother of the poor, as she was known by all. The sick felt deeply loved by her, as she cared for each one as if he were Christ himself. Her charity, once intense, became now a burning fire that consumed her very life and offered it entirely to God. In Marburg, Elizabeth also found a refuge for her soul wounded by the loss of her husband. The pain never completely disappeared, and it did not need to, because God transformed it into a source of even deeper compassion. Every patient she supported, every weakened body she held up, every tear she dried became for her an encounter with Louis, now united with Christ in eternity. Instead of withdrawing into bitter mourning or lamentations, she transformed her longing into spiritual strength, channeling all her human love into an even more intense love for God and the poor. Few saints lived so deeply the union between human suffering and supernatural charity as Saint Elizabeth of Hungary. While directing the hospital, Elizabeth also intensified her life of prayer and penance. She prayed the divine office, attended Holy Mass with admirable frequency, and kept long periods of silent contemplation. She wore hair shirts, practiced rigorous fasts, and constantly sought to unite her life to the suffering and merciful Christ. All these sacrifices, however, were carried out with sweetness and serenity, never with harshness or bitterness. She herself said that her penances were small offerings of love before the greatness of divine mercy. No one who lived with her saw in them exaggeration or fanaticism, but only the manifestation of a deeply devout heart, totally surrendered to God's will. Elizabeth's fame for holiness began to spread not only through Thuringia, but throughout the German region. People traveled from afar to see her, to receive her words of comfort, or to ask for her intercession. Some simply wanted to contemplate the woman who, being a princess, had chosen to live as a servant of the poor. Others, deeply moved by her humility, experienced sudden conversions. Elizabeth never allowed such demonstrations to feed her vanity. On the contrary, she always said that everything was God's work and that she was only a small instrument in the hands of divine mercy. With the hospital already functioning fully, Elizabeth redoubled her dedication to the most suffering. On days of epidemic, she was the first to enter the infirmaries, aware of the risk yet confident in divine protection. Many tried to prevent her, saying that her presence put her health and even her life in danger. She, however, answered with conviction that her mission was to serve to the end, and that she feared nothing when united to God's will. This courage, joined to the tenderness with which she treated each patient, was clear proof of an extraordinary holiness that was already shining forth before her death. Thus Elizabeth built in Marburg a work that would remain forever marked in the history of the Church, a hospital that was not only a center of physical healing, but a true house of mercy, where the poor were treated as brothers and the dying were accompanied with dignity to their encounter with God. This work summed up perfectly the essence of her life: to love without measure, to serve without reserve, and to surrender herself completely to the imitation of Christ, poor, humble, and merciful. The last years of the life of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary were marked by such profound spiritual intensity that many testimonies record that she seemed already to live between earth and heaven. Her total surrender to the Franciscan ideal made her a shining example of what it means to love God without reserve and to serve one's neighbor with a completely detached heart. Although she was still very young, she would not reach the age of 25, her soul had matured in an extraordinary way through charity, suffering, and constant prayer. It was as if God had hastened in her the process of holiness, molding in a few years what many take a lifetime to attain. Her presence in Marburg was an inexhaustible source of consolation, but also of silent admiration, for everyone perceived that they were in the presence of a woman truly touched by divine grace. Despite her evident purity and holiness, Elizabeth faced very harsh trials in her final years. The spiritual direction of Conrad of Marburg, although sincere in its zeal, was extremely rigid, indeed severe, and often imposed excessive penances, painful decisions, and public humiliations that would have crushed any other soul less strengthened by grace. Elizabeth, however, accepted everything with patience and humility, convinced that obeying God's will was more important than defending her own rights or relieving her suffering. This heroic obedience was one of the most striking marks of her final journey. She submitted to Conrad's orders not out of weakness, but out of love for Christ, who also became obedient unto death, even death on a cross. This period of inner trials made her union with Christ even deeper. Elizabeth lived in a kind of constant contemplation, seeing in every event of daily life a reflection of Jesus' passion. Each humiliation was for her a plunge into Calvary. Each detachment, a renewal of her vow of poverty. Each sleepless night spent watching over the sick, a silent participation in Christ's agony in the Garden of Gethsemane. Her spirituality, although demanding, was full of sweetness and trust. There was no resentment, harshness, or rebellion in her. Her obedience sprang from a love so great that it can only be understood in the light of supernatural grace. In the administration of the hospital, Elizabeth continued working with her own hands until the very end. Even physically weakened, she insisted on attending to the gravest patients, especially the abandoned and the dying. She knew that her encounter with each of them was an encounter with Christ. Some testimonies state that when she entered the rooms of the terminally ill, her face took on such a gentle and luminous expression that many were moved simply by her presence. For those who died alone, she was a mother. For those who died in fear, she was comfort. For those who died in misery, she was dignity. In every life she touched, Elizabeth left a mark of love and hope that remained even after the death of the sick. Her health quickly began to decline as a result of long, sleepless nights, intense penances, constant fasting, and close contact with contagious diseases. But Elizabeth did not complain. On the contrary, she said that her pains were small compared to the pains of Christ, and that she welcomed them as gifts meant to unite her soul still more deeply to her beloved. Many tried to convince her to rest, to slow her pace, or to allow others to take on some of her tasks, but she replied serenely that she preferred to spend herself completely for love, keeping nothing back for herself. During this final period, her life of prayer reached an extraordinary intensity. She spent long moments in deep contemplation, sometimes entering silent ecstasies in which she seemed to lose all awareness of the world around her. In her small cell, built beside the hospital, she prayed on her knees before a simple wooden cross, surrendering to God every thought, every breath, and every suffering. Some witnesses report that, upon leaving prayer, her face radiated an inexplicable light, as though an inner brightness shone through her physical frailty. It was evident that her soul was already drawing rapidly near to full union with God. Despite her declining physical condition, Elizabeth maintained a serene joy that deeply impressed all who lived with her. This joy did not come from the absence of pain, but from the certainty of Christ's presence. She often said that true happiness did not lie in the absence of suffering, but in the fullness of love. For this reason, she never ceased to sing simple hymns, especially songs that exalted God's humility and mercy. Many times, her soft voice echoed through the hospital corridors in the middle of the night, like a balm for the sick who struggled against pain and fear. As her death approached, Elizabeth began to set her final wishes in order. She distributed the little she still possessed, asked forgiveness of all whom she might have offended, blessed her children, and entrusted everything to divine providence. She did not desire honors, grand funerals, or material remembrances. She only wished to die as she had lived, poor, humble, and deeply united to the crucified Christ. When she realized that her hour was near, she asked that the Passion according to St. John, the text that most moved her heart, be read aloud at her side, and she placed her hands on her chest in the form of a cross, a sign of the total surrender that had characterized her entire life. On the night of her death, the small room in which she lived was filled with such profound peace that those around her immediately realized something extraordinary was happening. Elizabeth smiled faintly and uttered her last words, "I want to follow only my Lord." With this final act of loving abandonment, she surrendered her soul to God and brought to a close a life marked by mercy, humility, and a love capable of transforming everyone around her. Her death was not an end, but the supreme testimony of the holiness that blossoms when a soul gives itself entirely to the divine will. At only 24 years of age, Elizabeth left this world, but her work, her light, and her sanctity would remain forever as a beacon for the Church, for the poor, and for all who wish to follow Christ with radicalism and tenderness. Her life, so brief and yet so intense, became a spiritual treasure that continues to inspire generations of Christians to this day. After her death, the fame of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary's holiness spread with impressive speed throughout Europe. That young princess who had renounced the comforts of court, that mother of the poor who spent herself entirely for love of Christ, and that 24-year-old woman who had lived a life more intense than many do in decades, began to be venerated immediately by the simple people who recognized in her a bright reflection of divine mercy. The poor she had fed wept at her passing as if they had lost a mother. The sick she had healed with her own hands remembered her tenderness and the light that shone from her face. and even the nobles who had once criticized her fell silent before the irrefutable witness of the holiness of her life. It was evident that Elizabeth was not only a virtuous woman, but a true friend of God. It did not take long for countless accounts of miracles attributed to her intercession to arise. The sick who visited her tomb reported sudden and inexplicable healings. People oppressed by anguish or deep suffering found peace. Pilgrims claimed to smell a gentle fragrance at the site of her burial, a traditional sign of the presence of holiness. Popular devotion grew so much that the city of Marburg began to receive pilgrims from various regions of Europe, becoming an important spiritual center. The hospital she had founded continued to function as a place of welcome, and many said they still felt Elizabeth's invisible presence accompanying the dying and consoling the afflicted. The canonization process of Elizabeth was extraordinarily rapid for the standards of the time, which demonstrates the spiritual impact her life had on the Church and the Christian people. Only 4 years after her death, a very short time for canonical criteria, Pope Gregory IX proclaimed her a saint, officially recognizing what was already evident to all who had known her or heard her story. In canonizing her, the Pope highlighted her boundless charity, sublime humility, and heroic fidelity to the gospel, virtues that made her a model for kings and queens, but also for the poor and simple. The Church saw in Elizabeth a perfect witness of the Franciscan spirit, lived with intensity and beauty within lay, married, and later consecrated life. Her canonization also reinforced a profound truth. Holiness is not the privilege of a few, nor does it depend on social position, culture, or power. Elizabeth was noble, but chose to live as poor. She was a mother, but preferred to be a servant of the most abandoned. She was influential, but renounced human glory. Her life showed that the gospel is not a theory, but a real path accessible to all who desire to love God above everything. For this reason, Saint Elizabeth became a universal model, venerated both by the powerful and by the marginalized, inspiring kings, religious, mothers, young people, and all who want to follow Jesus with radicalism. The impact of her life also extended to charitable institutions in medieval Europe. Many hospitals, shelters, and religious orders began to adopt her as their patroness, recognizing in her a powerful intercessor for those who serve the poor and the sick. Christian tradition associates her figure with the corporal works of mercy, especially the care of the sick, assistance to the poor, and hospitality to those in need. Her example inspired hundreds of charitable initiatives over the centuries, from shelters to modern hospitals that still bear her name. Saint Elizabeth continues to be regarded as protector of nurses, the poor, the rejected, and all who dedicate their lives to serving the most vulnerable. The symbolism of roses, linked to the most famous miracle of her life, became one of the most characteristic elements of her iconography. The rose, which miraculously appeared beneath her cloak when she was hiding bread for the poor, came to represent the transformation that charity brings about in the world. Elizabeth, who transformed suffering into love, misery into consolation, and pain into hope, came to be symbolized by this delicate yet strong flower, a sign that true beauty is born from total surrender to God. Thus, paintings, sculptures, and stained glass windows throughout Europe began to depict her with roses in her hands or falling from her mantle, as a reminder that mercy transforms everything it touches. Another important aspect of her legacy is the witness of holiness lived within the married state. At a time when many believed that holiness was reserved for monks and religious, Elizabeth showed that the sacrament of matrimony can also be a full path of perfection. At Louis' side, she lived a union marked by love, respect, and the search for God's will. Together, they transformed Wartburg Castle into a place of justice, mercy, and service, showing that Christian marriage when lived in faith, can be a source of holiness, both for the spouses and for everyone around them. This witness continues to inspire Christian families throughout the world. As the centuries passed, the figure of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary continued to illuminate the history of the Church with her gentleness and strength. Her life is taught not only as an example of mercy, but as a call to personal conversion. She reminds us that holiness does not begin with great gestures, but with small acts of love done with sincerity. Caring for the poor, paying attention to the sick, being patient in trials, and remaining faithful in prayer are concrete paths to union with God. Elizabeth showed that when the heart surrenders itself entirely to Christ, even the smallest actions become great in the eyes of heaven. Her spiritual legacy also speaks deeply to our times, in which so many people live in anguish, isolation, or wounded by social injustices. The life of Saint Elizabeth is an invitation to rediscover the transforming power of mercy, the beauty of simplicity, and the depth of a faith lived without reserve. She teaches us that true greatness is not found in wealth, power, or fame, but in the capacity to love and to serve. In a world marked by inequalities, her life is a beacon pointing toward the gospel, reminding us that everyone has dignity, everyone deserves care, and everyone is called to the joy of holiness. Finally, Saint Elizabeth of Hungary remains one of the most beloved saints of Christianity, venerated not only for her royal origin, but for the kingship she achieved in the eyes of God. Her miracles, her purity, her courage, and her immense charity continue to inspire millions of the faithful. Her name echoes in hospitals, parishes, social works, and in the hearts of the poor who still today find in her a friend and intercessor. The Church celebrates her as a perfect model of evangelical love, a woman who transformed suffering into light and pain into hope. The life of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary is therefore a hymn to divine mercy and a permanent call to holiness. She lived little, but lived fully. She loved without measure, served without reserve, and trusted in God with a courage that crosses the centuries. Her example continues to echo in the hearts of those who wish to follow Jesus with fidelity and tenderness. And thus, like roses that bloom even in winter, her memory remains alive, perfuming history with the gentle scent of charity and illuminating the world with the eternal light of holiness.